When George asked me, Daphne, I have to have a title, I gave him a title. It was really one of those off of the top of your head kinds of things. And after that, I thought about a poem which I have not been able to find since, by Langston Hughes, which has a line in it, "They've taken my blues and gone." And essentially, in a way, that is the point of departure for my talk today. It is not it's not an accusatory statement. It is rather a statement of fact, but a statement of fact that has a lot of implications. Some may be negative, but for me, most of them are positive. Definitions are the best point of departure for a discussion of a topic that so many people think they know well, or at least of which they consider they have general understanding. The blues is one such topic because the term appears in a variety of contexts: public, private, and commercial. It can describe a mood, a color, and be as amorphous or as ambiguous, as powerful or ephemeral as semantics allow. For example, when we say Big Blue, most of us think about IBM. But if you went to the University of Michigan, you have a different connotation for the word Big Blue. The blues and the grays represent, of course, two opposing forces during the Civil War era. Are the blues in the Naval Academy's football squad? Are a blue funk? Or as on today's ABC Good Morning America, the Depression, the actual state of the blues. We can talk about a pristine blue or a celestial blue, but blues, that whole term conjures up different meanings to all of us depending on where we are mentally at the particular time. For the purposes of this lecture, I will restrict my definitions to those set forth by the creators of the musical genre, the blues. The blues women and blues men give us the most vivid description and interpretation of the music and the black community from which it emerged. I will then explore the changes wrought in the music as it moved away from its derivative source and became an urban cultural form. Then, through continuing commercialization, was co-opted by persons from the majority white population in the United States and Europe. From the blues women and men, quote, "The blues are nothing but the facts of life," according to Willie Dixon. And Willie Dixon probably is the most preeminent blues composer and promoter in the second half of this century. He's just recently deceased. Quote, "I sing the blues to comfort me on. Most all my blues is about myself." This is a quotation from Sippy Wallace, who was my blues sister. And as we talked one time, this is what she told me. Quote, "Blues is like a doctor. A blues player plays for the worried people. See, they enjoy it. Like the doctor works from the outside of the body to the inside of the body, but the blues works on the insides of the insides," unquote. This is Roosevelt Sykes, a blues pianist. Quote, "You got to sing the blues with your soul. It looks like you hurt in the deep down part of your heart. You really hurt when you sing the blues," unquote. And this is Big Mama Blues, a Memphis blues singer. From literary observers of black culture, we also have a perspective on the blues as a genre and what it meant to black people. Quote, "Now I'm claiming a great deal for the blues. I'm using them as a metaphor. I want to talk about the blues, not only because they speak of this particular experience of life and of this state of being, but because they contain the toughness that manages to make this experience articulate. And I want to suggest that the acceptance of this anguish one finds in the blues and the expression of it creates also, however odd this may sound, a kind of joy," unquote. And this is from James Baldwin. I want you to think about it. From this anguish, one also finds a kind of joy. That's at odds with what Richard Wright posed as a sort of a state of anguish and depression and languor. Quote, Bessie Smith might have been a blues queen to the society at large, but within the Negro community, where the blues were a total way of life and a major expression of an attitude toward life, she was a priestess, a celebrant who affirmed the values of the group and man's ability to deal with that chaos. And this is from Ralph Ellison. And if you've read Invisible Man, you know that the blues character is a very important theme that goes throughout that book. I'd also like to bring to you a small quotation from a recent New York Times article that deals with blues as a form, and to show you what it suggests in terms of both its cultural wellspring as well as what it has done in terms of the music itself. Now, the blues is so simple structurally that it's very accessible. Anybody who knows anything about music is the tonic chord, the subdominant chord, the dominant chord sometimes with a fifth, with a seventh, a flatted seventh, and back to the tonic. Bang, that's it. That's one reason why guitar players have such an easy time with it, because if they learn those 4 chords on the guitar, then they have it made, you know, and then you can do what you want around it. And so a lot of people think it's so simplistic that anybody can do the blues because you can manage that part in terms of its harmonic structure. In terms of its structure as a form, it generally follows a 12-bar 3-line structure, that is with the first 2 lines almost exactly alike, and a 3rd line that is a resolution of that, the first 2 lines, or a usual song form, which is AABA. Sometimes either of those forms will have a refrain attached to it. Okay. Those refrains may be just interjected by the performer and may not be found in any written form, depending on who's doing the performance. Well, what this author, and let me be fair to him, Peter Watrous, who writes a great deal on popular music in the New York Times, has said, is that the form is easy to understand, but with its endless repetitions within an austere structure, it is amazing how complicated it can become because of harmonic substitutions, rhythmic patterns, and tempo changes. Born roughly 100 years ago, it is the product of disenfranchised blacks. But to do it well, the form demands a sense of the past. A musician has to spend time searching and amassing information to achieve mastery of the form. Now, many people assume just the opposite. They assume that once they get that harmonic structure straight, and they know they can do the 2 and the 1, the 2 and the 1, or the 16-bar line, they got it made, and they're blues musicians. But what I am going to point out today, and what I think he is suggesting in this article, is that it is much more complex than that. And the assumption that it's simplistic has something to do with how we value the people who produce the music rather than the music itself. To backtrack a little bit, just to help you to understand how this music has such a deep, he says 100 years, I say it may be 500. We really don't know. Because there are connections between African song forms, African musical traditions that tied directly in many ways into what the blues became. One is some of the characteristics. It's antiphonal, as much of the music in traditional African context. Well, really, even if you look at some of the popular art music forms that are coming out of contemporary African music, you'll have a lot of call and response or antiphony. It's repetitious because one of the values in African cultures is that it is so sweet you have to do it over and over again. So the repetition is not something that should be considered to be, they are too ignorant or too simplistic to be able to do any more than over and over again. And that is why that ecstasy that derives from that repetition is an important thing that connects not only the performer but the singer to the music. Its use of semitones rather than diatonics. And although we attempt to write the blues, if you hear a real deeply involved Delta blues man in particular, a Delta blues woman, you will find they are still using semitones. And you will find that they're playing them on their guitars and their harmonicas as well as singing them. And probably the only thing in contemporary Western music that can do that besides the guitar is the use of electronics. Because with electronics, we're beginning to get smaller and smaller increments in terms of sound, tonic sounds. Often there's a pentatonic or heptatonic approach to scales. Often, not always. It is very important for the singer in African context to have verbal dexterity. That is, to be able to ad-lib, be able to bring forth ideas immediately, to be able to call upon contemporary context to change the basic lyric, but also to keep it up to date. In terms of actual vocal devices, we find in African context a great deal of use of falsetto by men and women, guttural sounds, which are appropriated both in order to evoke certain spiritual aspects, but also guttural sounds to imitate aspects of nature. But those guttural sounds are found both in male and female singers. A great use of melisma, because single notes seem not to be able to capture certain flavors. So worrying a note, as is said by blues people, is very important because it adds a kind of emotional expressivity that you could not have by just going from note to note to note, but you just worry around a note before you move on. The use of nasal tones is also evident. Now, I'm going to play 4 examples of African music, and I want you to listen for. The first example is a female singer, and she is being accompanied only by a bell. But if you notice, she is making a great range with her voice that is a song that is invoking a particular spirit. Okay. The second one will give you an example of antiphony, where you will hear a male voice that is being responded to by a women's choir. And the third one will be the use of a guitar-type instrument that sounds very much like the style of blues guitar. And the male voice is singing and accompanying himself with this guitar. Okay, that comes from the area of the Burundi people in South Central Africa. And then finally, the last one is going to be very unusual, and all I want to tell you about that is it is not a song. That's about the best fact. It is not a song. This is a great next. Okay, this is the guitar. I'm sorry. And you're going to hear the women's choir answering. Okay, the next one is the male voice with the guitar solo. And this use of recitative, and he's responding with his own non-lexical sound. Now this is just male voices doing a rhythm that might have been done by an instrument. But the reason I want you to hear it is because in African American singing, often the voice is used with the use of onomatopoeia or with some kind of non-lexical sign. Hanky panky, ranky danky, ranky danky, ricky dicky, ricky dicky. It's the falsetto. This is a male voice. Okay, I'd have to move along because we're running out of time. Now, of course, if you noticed all of those, whether they were slow or fast, there was a continual pulse under them. Okay. Now, many people will say that, well, African American music is more, it got its rhythm from Africa, but it got its melody from Europe. But that really is too, you just can't quite put it down to that and be finished with it, because it really isn't so. Yes, the introduction to hymnody and psalmic singing by the Christians when Africans came to the United States did have a great deal of impact. But that impact did not take away much of the traditional practices they had, because it was so very important to them. Dance was a linked art form to most music making in Africa. Dance, especially in terms of religious practices, and also visual arts. So music was it was an interdisciplinary art making. It was performance and visual arts, as well as vocal arts or literary arts, as I like to say it. So you'll always find that there's a kind of expressivity that is emphasized through a pulse that causes body movement, or at least implies bodily movement. And that instead of the use of mask and body mask or facial mask in the African American context, you have the dramatic expression on the face and body movements that emphasize the text. And what you have is that the text is the overriding value, and that the best blues singers were those who understood that and made sure that the melody nor the accompaniment overshadowed the value of the text, okay? And that is because in many African cultures, the articulation of ideas verbally, orally, was very important. And that's why you had a whole class of musicians who were actually generational, because they were taught in ways how to interpret history and culture textually, either through song or through music making, because certain music, whether it had an actual lyric written out for it, had lyrics implied in it. Okay. Now, another aspect is the imagery and the double entendre that you find in the text. We've already talked about non-lexicality and onomatopoeia. You also find declamation and ad-libbing, because the blues person understands and acknowledges his or her role to tell you something, either about what somebody did bad or wrong, and also to tell you how they are going to deal with that particular act. And you find that that flows straight through. Now, our next examples are Southern rural examples. First with a fife and drum, and second with a solo female voice that will give you a good example. In fact, in many ways, she almost does the same thing with her voice that first solo voice we heard with the bell from Africa. And I hope I've moved it up. She's responding to herself. Don't you trouble well, the fellow went out in Texas, black woman. To hear that while I'm alone. And next, this is still a style of blues, this time with the fife and the drum. The voice is adding a rhythmic pulse. You hear the instrument does what a voice does sometimes. And that's what it makes the sound of the train, okay? And you'll find trains, the topics of many, many blues. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Midnight Special by Lead Belly, but you will find the train blues proliferating all through blues literature, because one of the aspects of the blues is escape, to get away from what it is that's bothering you. And that comes straight out of the slave context, where the train was all the freedom train, was a kind of imagery that was a part of the slave song literature. So that continues through when you see, especially in terms of the music that emerged from chain gangs and prison work farms. It's the train song, okay. Of course, we're not talking about the Metroliner. We're talking about real trains. Okay, I suppose you recognize that voice, but I want to say something before we go any further with that one. In the 1920s, you had probably the biggest attention, the most attention that was ever paid to the blues in the history of the music, okay? And it wasn't that it hadn't been performed, but because for a good 20 years at least, it had been a part of the vaudeville circuit with people like Ma Rainey performing it in the tent shows when these shows traveled around. But it was a trained musician, that is someone who had formal pianistic and other kinds of training, who put the music into a formal written context, and that's William C. Handy. And as a result of that, he and the bands that he directed in Memphis established a tradition where blues then became a band form also. And as a result of that, we have the bands in the New Orleans area and other cities, New Orleans, Memphis, that are also putting together the seeds of ragtime locked in with the harmonies of the blues and creating a kind of a new sound that eventually becomes jazz. Now, this is Daphne Harrison's interpretation. If somebody else tells you differently, that's there, but this is how I'm arriving at the more that I listen and study the music. Now, what jazz does, we won't go to, but I want to say this. Any jazz person worth his or her salt knows and understands the blues deeply. And I dare say you will be able to tell, your ear will tell you that if you know and understand the blues, whether that person is a good jazzman, okay? And you see that when young people like Wynton Marsalis and what's the Jordan, I can't remember his first name now. This kid is a trumpeter, but I can't, but that's okay. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to say is the harmonic underpinnings of the blues are where jazz got its soul, okay? And so that you will find that in this coupling of the jazz bands as they're developing, that is the bands of Kid Ory and King Oliver and that ilk, as they're coupling with singers like Bessie Smith and Sippy Wallace and Clara Smith and Ma Rainey, you're beginning to have both of them developing into a much more complex art form. This commercialization during the 20s did two things. It expanded the audience of the music to a larger population of blacks because they were still considered race music, and the record companies were pressing those recordings not for total public dissemination, but to sell back to black folks. But what they discovered, much to their joy, after a great deal of hesitation about even recording a black woman singing the blues, was that they could make money, you know. And then everybody wanted to have a blues woman so that they could make some more money. So the 20s was that era. Strangely, toward the end of the period, they began to notice the country or rural type blues singers. So that Blind Lemon Jefferson and people of that ilk began to be recorded more heavily toward the end of the decade than at the beginning of the decade. Two very different kinds of approaches to the blues because the women singers brought a sophistication that had not been there before. They were stage stars, both in their presence and in their performance, very glamorous, very, very urban in their approach, very urban in what they sang about. Often they wrote their own lyrics and their own blues. Often they sang what others wrote for them. But they imprinted upon that music their own style. And as I was about to say, the most magnificent, of course, of all of them was Bessie Smith. Ma Rainey was wonderful in her own way because she connected directly with black people in a way that others did not. But Bessie was the magnificent in terms of the blues singer. And you will hear in this particular piece that she's singing, again, that call and response. But she's doing it with her own voice. I chose this time just Bessie and a piano so that you wouldn't have the clutter of the orchestra in the background, and you can concentrate on her as an artist. The next one that you'll hear will be Robert Johnson, really almost 15 years later from the Bessie Smith. And now people are beginning to pay attention to Robert Johnson after almost 55 or 60 years. It's really kind of funny. But it's because he's such a maverick in terms of blues artists. Louis Armstrong playing an instrumental blues, and then Sidney Bechet. How many people have heard of Sidney Bechet? Okay. The reason you haven't is because Sidney Bechet left, I guess right before World War II, and didn't come back except to visit, because the climate of acceptance was much greater. But he was in orchestras with people like Louis Armstrong in the 20s, a magnificent clarinetist. Now, I've chosen him, and I'll tell you why. But now we're going to hear Bessie Smith singing Jailhouse Blues, and followed with Robert Johnson, Louis Armstrong, and Sidney Bechet. Robert Johnson.
I got to keep moving, I got to keep moving. Blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail. Blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail. And the day keeps on winding. There's a hellhound on my trail, hellhound on my trail, hellhound on my trail.
I'm stopping because I don't want to miss some other things. Okay. We'll come back to Sidney Bechet later if we have time. Okay. One of the things that happened during that decade and the next decade was that Cafe Society discovered the blues and jazz and decided that they wanted to do something with it. If you want to read anything hilarious, you should read some of the latest home journals, articles that talk about, it's the same way they talk about rap now, you know, children would get sick, don't let them go to those dances, and it does things to your mind and it corrupts them and blah, blah, blah. So, but in order to make the music acceptable, I guess they did the same thing they did with Vanilla Ice. It says, You clean it up and whiten it up and put some strings to it, and then it won't make you sick. So Paul Whiteman did that with jazz, and he became, very popular because he took what Louis Armstrong and those did and made it nice, and you can go get all beautiful and dressed up and go to the Waldorf Astoria and hear the music, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe so, but there was a young Jewish man who was so taken by the music that he just could not resist incorporating it with the kinds of things that he also brought from his Hebraic background, and that was George Gershwin. Now, he was a man who could get into the music. And what I'm going to play is a sample from a set of preludes that he wrote for the piano. And the second prelude is based on a blues theme. That same theme, if you listen to his Concerto in F, you will find it in that particular. If you listen to Rhapsody in Blue, if you listen to practically anything that he did, except maybe for some of his ballads, you will find blues jazz themes in it. And he says that, he acknowledges that because he loves the music. And this is how he outlined, I hope I didn't throw it away. Yes. His plan for the Concerto in F. This is what he wrote down. This is my plan. 1, rhythm. 2, melody, in parentheses, blues. 3, more rhythm. Now, if you really understand the blues, that's really all you have to do is, get it. So now what we're going to hear is some of that prelude, and of course, that most beautiful blues, Summertime, from Porgy and Bess, because it really is a blues song. Okay. And then quickly move on to a blues theme from the Afro-American Symphony by William Grant Still. He opens it with a blues theme. Okay. And finally, from Stravinsky's Ebony Concerto, a little blues theme that you find in there by the clarinetist in the second movement. Okay. Best, but she's singing Summertime, yes. Okay. I'm going on a little. Clara, yes. This is the Still. It's called Blue Horizon. Right after this, we're going to hear Benny Goodman and the Ebony Concerto. by Stravinsky. Okay, after the war, we had a new movement in jazz called bop, but they still use the blues forms. Now what I'm trying to show is how blues proliferates in a variety of forms, both by black and white artists, so-called classical and popular composers. And what we're going to hear next is Charlie Parker playing the inimitable Thelonious Monk's Round Midnight. And then Blue Monk, with Monk actually on the piano, with Miles and Monk. Now, if we don't get any further than this, because I'm told people have to leave, those who don't mind staying, and if George doesn't mind them staying, I would like to tell you a couple of other things. Okay. Monk and Blue Monk. Okay. I'll just talk for the rest of it, so since we're in a hurry. I do want to let you know that what is now called rhythm and blues was blues with rhythm added to it. And people like Big Maybelle, Otis Redding, Ruth Brown, Laverne Baker, James Brown, of course, Marvin Gaye, Coco Taylor, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, on and on, were ones who established this music, but they also clearly set it right in a blues context, okay? And we need to, things that are called rhythm and blues now, you know, it's just a big bunch of stuff, then I think it's just for commercial purposes that they lump it together. But when we're talking about rhythm and blues, as in the late 40s and the 50s on forward, we're thinking about a particular kind of thing in that context. And if you listen to James Brown, Etta James and Aretha Franklin, then you can understand what's happening now. When you listen to Coco Taylor, you can understand what Janis Joplin tried to be about. And I said, because she never did make it, and although she was very sincere in what she attempted to do, she just did not understand what it was she was trying to do. And so when she tried to sound like Bessie Smith, as she said, she really couldn't be because she hadn't done her homework. Okay, I have samples, but we're running over time. Well, during that later period of the 60s, folk music became very popular, and blues men and women and people went back to get them. Big Boy Crudup and a whole lot of folks were brought to the forefront during that time. In fact, Roosevelt Sykes enjoyed a renewed audience as a result of the young white college audiences that were going to Woodstock and other places like that. Sippy Wallace became known again, as did Victoria Spivey. And And so we had another generation of young white artists who began to pattern themselves after the blues artists. And Bonnie Raitt worked with Sippy Wallace for a long time, and Roosevelt Sykes, and also sometimes Little Brother Montgomery. And if I can find it, because I've skipped over a lot of things, I'll play a sample of Sippy and Bonnie singing together. Finally, country music and blues are inseparably linked in many ways, whether people acknowledge it or not. And Ray Charles was instrumental in bringing that into a kind of public recognition when he made his Country and Western album in the 60s. And as a result of that, you had it being acceptable for black musicians to become country musicians and white musicians to become blues musicians. And so you have that kind of crossover, and you end up with some very wonderful singers, performers like Stevie Ray Vaughan. And you get some, well, we won't talk about that. And then you have someone like a Charlie Pride and some more contemporary people. And in a way, you have a lovely syncretism going on, which produces groups like the Robert Cray Band, okay? And the interesting thing is the audiences are getting funny too. It used to be, you could say, oh, well, these are just the white college kids. Black kids, the blues, that's not what's happening. And they were just busy following whatever the newest party type music was. But now we see again that people are going back to the music and revisiting it for the right reasons. And that is, where did it come from? What did it mean? What does it tell us about the life of the people who produced it? And so we can say the blues is gone, but in many ways it's back in many more forms, many more scintillating examples. When you find a Michael Bolton who decides that he's going to be the new Ray Charles, okay, it's all right because he does it well, okay? But then you have persons who want to be, I guess I shouldn't say that, I don't know whether he does or not, but Bruce Springsteen tries so hard to sound like James Brown in many ways, and when he's doing just rock, he's straight on it. But when he tries, like in Born in the USA, to get that deep, gravelly, black voice sound, it sounds like mixing apples and oranges. And that is not to take away from him as an artist. I don't mean that. It's just that sometimes you cannot appropriate a sound and leave the stuff that it came from off, because what you get is it's definitely, what is the word called? And it's not a duplicate. Well, anyway. Yeah, well, okay. I didn't want to be that. But anyhow, let me close out by saying this, and again, coming from that article in the New York Times, where he says, blues, not the genre, but the form, looks as if it's going to outlast many of the cultural products of the 20th century. It may just end up being one of the century's better moments, transcending its background and attaining universal acceptance as a cultural landmark. Another definition of a word that was talked about earlier by Mr. Cominges is the word classical. And I think that we are approaching that, because as the music spreads out and becomes more refined, its original form is going to be regarded more and more as a classic, because that's what a classic is. It is something that is so pure and so fine that other things emanate from it. And so the blues may be gone, but I think they're on their way to a better place. Thank you. I'll put the music.